Today, the Pirate Bay returns, China gets more aggressive against VPNs, and everybody's a terrorist with new laws. Your host is Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Good evening and welcome to Liberties Report Week 5, 2015. The Pirate Bay returns, China gets aggressive against VPN connections, and it seems everybody's a terrorist. The Pirate Bay returns one day early. It was announced to return on February 1st. It actually returned on January 31st. And it has become a symbol of resilience that is frankly unmatched on the internet as of now. Having had an entire industry thrown at it, it keeps returning. The interesting thing here is that there are many services that are far better than the Pirate Bay as of now. The Popcorn Time being one for movies, and for music, you have plenty of services, Spotify, Pandora, Grooveshark, what have you, that cannot match, where the Pirate Bay cannot match these new services. It's a sobering thought that the Pirate Bay has been around since 2003. In other words, is actually older than both Facebook and Twitter. That is a sobering thought, isn't it? However, the myth that the Pirate Bay was responsible in any way, shape or form for losses of profit for the copyright industry, which we knew to be false all along, seems to have been proven false. In Norway, piracy has, or rather the unlicensed manufacturing of music, has taken an enormous plunge in Norway, now down to a mere 4% of consumption. As I said, Spotify and other services has simply taken the place of the Pirate Bay. What's interesting is that copyright industry profits still are not up. So it appears that unlicensed manufacturing was completely irrelevant, at worst, to the losses of profit. And as a result of this completely false business assumption, we've lost pretty much all the liberties we had in the analog world because of an industry's obsession of preventing people from sharing interesting things with each other. Damn the consequences to civil liberties. That is a really sad story. How, at the same line, China is going aggressive on virtual private connections, virtual private networks, so-called VPNs. They've always looked down on VPNs in Beijing, but recently they've taken a very aggressive stance, and in just this week, the Great Firewall of China was further upgraded to just filter out VPNs where it can find them. In short, the Western services of Facebook, Twitter, and Google should not be used in China. Instead, Beijing has a preference for the equivalent services Renren, Weibo, and Baidu. You can see a clear parallel to the copyright industry here, where the Chinese government is convinced that if only its Chinese services is given a chance against the current dominant services, then the Chinese services will prove superior in the end, even if they have to sacrifice a lot of civil liberties to get there. The reasoning here is, frankly, quite identical to that of the copyright industry, even though the copyright industry should never have been allowed to buy laws and abolish, erode, and diminish civil liberties in the first place, just because they couldn't make money otherwise. We can predict that this is going to spread to the Western world fairly soon enough. As discussed on last week on Liberties Report, we've seen how China has gone from being a moral abyss to an example to follow in terms of how it deals with the internet. And that is a severe problem. We can predict that Western governments are going to be cracking down on VPNs soon enough, following the Chinese example. And the reason we can predict this is not just because it has followed Chinese governments in the past, but that everybody's a terrorist these days. We warned early on that terrorist laws didn't really mean that somebody who wasn't a criminal before will suddenly become a criminal. Widespread destruction of property and lives was already a crime. Preparation for widespread destruction of property and lives was also already a crime. What so-called terrorist laws are doing is removing due process, removing presumption of innocence, and removing the right to defend yourself and the right to a public trial. That is a much larger problem, frankly, than the terrorists themselves and the terrorist acts themselves. And obviously, with the terrorist laws or anti-terrorist laws in place, they are being used and abused for everything else. We can observe in the UK that terrorist laws are now being used against people who do not pay their bills, including their TV license. So, if you're not paying your television license to the BBC, you are now a terrorist. This goes hand in hand with the fact that if you're protesting in the streets, you are also a terrorist. This isn't necessarily what most people think of terrorism, but it's how governments are using this newly minted concept in legislation with no other reason than because they can and they are getting away with it. In New York City, we see a new police force being formed of 350 people with heavily armed weaponry, military-style weaponry. And this police force of 350 people will be used against terrorist acts and protesters. Think about that again. They are creating a heavily armed police force to be used against terrorism, which is causing widespread death and destruction, and political protests. These two concepts are dealt with in the same manner. If that doesn't ring alarm bells all over your head, it's time to realize what is happening. This, of course, is just one way to circumvent the law against military force involving itself in civil duty, military forces doing police work. If you can equip the civilian police with military equipment, it doesn't matter anymore that the military is forbidden by law to involve in police work because the police has already become the military. As Commander Adama said in Battlestar Galactica, there's a very good reason we separate the police and the military. The police protect and serve the civilian population. The military fights enemies of the state. When the military and police become one and the same, the civilian population tend to become the enemies of the state. It seems things will still get a lot worse before they get any better. I'm Rick Falkvinger and this is Liberties Report. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. Good night.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Liberties Report is produced using exclusively free software.